every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. In the pantheon of organized crime, there are figures who become legends through brute force. Their names are synonymous with bloodshed, with streets painted in fear and loyalty enforced at the end of a gun. They are the Al Capones, the Pablo Escobars, the John Gottis. Their power is loud, visceral, and ultimately finite. But then there are the others, the quiet ones, the ones who understand that true, lasting power in the modern world isn't built on muscle, but on mathematics. It's not forged in alleyways, but in the sterile quiet of a boardroom, through the intricate dance of offshore accounts and shell corporations. It's a power that thrives not in the underworld, but in the gray spaces between nations, between legal and illegal, between crime and statecraft. This is the world of Semion Mogilevich. For decades, the name has been whispered in the halls of international law enforcement, a kind of criminal specter haunting the global financial system. The FBI once placed him on their 10 most wanted list, calling him the boss of bosses and the most dangerous mobster in the world. Yet, to look at him, you might not see a monster. You might see a portly, chain-smoking man with a university degree in economics. A man who presents himself as a simple grain merchant or a misunderstood businessman. This right here is the central paradox of Semion Mogilevich. He is both everywhere and nowhere, a multi-billionaire whose wealth is nearly impossible to trace, a puppeteer whose strings stretch across continents, yet whose hands remain impeccably clean. His story is not one of gangland warfare, but of something far more insidious and arguably far more powerful. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a truly global crime syndicate, an organization that represents the terrifying evolution of the mob. We will explore a criminal empire built not on territory, but on intellectual capital, an enterprise that weaponized the very tools of globalization, the free flow of capital, the rise of the internet, the porous borders of a post-Cold War world, to create a network of such complexity and influence that it has rendered its master virtually untouchable. This is the story of how a brilliant economist from Ukraine allegedly became the world's most powerful gangster, a ghost in the machine of international crime. To understand the architect, you must first understand the world that built him. Semion Mogilevich was born in 1946 in the Podil neighborhood of Kyiv, Ukraine, then a part of the Soviet Union. He was born into a world of ashes and reconstruction, a world of rigid ideology and stifling state control. And crucially, he was born into a Jewish family. In the officially atheist and deeply anti-Semitic Soviet state, this was a mark of otherness, a barrier to advancement within the rigid Communist Party structure. From the very beginning, Mogilevich was an outsider, forced to operate in the margins. But it is in the margins that creativity and cunning often flourish. Unlike the archetypal mobster who rises from the streets with little formal education, Mogilevich was intellectually gifted. He attended Lviv University in western Ukraine, where he earned a degree in economics. This single fact is perhaps the most critical key to unlocking the entire anatomy of his criminal enterprise. He didn't learn his trade in prison yards or through violent apprenticeships. He learned it in lecture halls, studying the very systems of finance and trade he would later learn to manipulate with surgical precision. His education provided him with a blueprint, not for building a business, but for exploiting the vulnerabilities of the entire global economic system. He saw the world not as a collection of people and places, but as a series of interconnected financial systems, each with its own rules, and each with its own loopholes. His criminal career began not with a bang, but with the quiet clicks of a calculator and the rustle of currency. In the 1970s, he engaged in petty black market currency trading, a common hustle in the currency-controlled Soviet economy. But his first truly significant scheme revealed the cold, calculated nature of his ambition. It was a racket that targeted his own people. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union began to permit Jewish citizens to emigrate to Israel and the United States. These émigrés were desperate to leave, but they were forced to abandon most of their assets. They couldn't simply wire their life savings abroad. Mogilevich saw an opportunity. He presented himself as a facilitator, a financial savior. He would approach these families and offer a deal. "Give me your rubles, your art, your jewelry," he would say. "I will use my connections to sell them, and once you are settled in your new home, I will ensure the money is waiting for you in hard currency." It was a promise of hope to people in a desperate situation. Of course, the money never arrived. Mogilevich and his small crew would take possession of the assets, sell them, and simply pocket the proceeds. The victims, now thousands of miles away in a new country with no recourse and no way to contact him, were left with nothing. This early con was a master class in his developing methodology. Identify a vulnerable population, exploit a systemic weakness, in this case, Soviet currency controls, and then create a jurisdictional chasm that makes recovery or prosecution impossible. It was cruel, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Then, in 1991, the world shifted on its axis. The Soviet Union, that monolithic superpower, crumbled. For most of its citizens, this was a time of chaos, uncertainty, and economic collapse. For Semion Mogilevich, it was the single greatest business opportunity in human history. The state-controlled economy was being dismantled in a chaotic frenzy of privatization. Vast state-owned industries, oil fields, manufacturing plants, mineral rights, were being sold off for pennies on the dollar to those with the connections and the capital to seize them. A new class of oligarchs was born overnight. Law and order evaporated, replaced by a kind of gangster capitalism, where contracts were enforced not by courts, but by car bombs. This was the primordial soup from which the modern Russian mafia would emerge. And Semion Mogilevich, with his economic degree and his criminal experience, was uniquely positioned to become its apex predator. He moved to the heart of this new wild frontier, Moscow. In the chaotic landscape of early 1990s Moscow, power was being consolidated by brutal, heavily armed gangs known as bratvas or brotherhoods. The most powerful of these was the Solantsevskaya Bratva, named for the Solantsevo district of Moscow from which it originated. They were the muscle. Thousands of unemployed soldiers, former athletes, and hardened criminals who controlled rackets across the city, from prostitution and gambling to extortion and car theft. They were violent and effective, but they were street-level thugs. They lacked the financial sophistication to launder their vast profits or to navigate the emerging global economy. They had the brawn, but they needed a brain. Semion Mogilevich became that brain. He didn't join the Solantsevskaya as a soldier. He formed a strategic alliance with them. He was their financial advisor, their money laundering guru, their key to the world of international finance. It was a marriage of convenience that would transform both parties. The Solantsevskaya gave Mogilevich protection, enforcement, and a massive river of illicit cash to manage. In return, Mogilevich gave them legitimacy and access. He taught them how to move their money out of Russia and into the stable, respectable banks of the West. He showed them how to set up offshore shell corporations, how to invest in legitimate businesses, and how to use the complexities of international law to their advantage. He was, in effect, the syndicate's chief financial officer. This alliance highlights a fundamental aspect of the Russian mafia's anatomy, which differs significantly from its Italian-American counterpart. La Cosa Nostra is a rigid top-down pyramid with a clear boss of all bosses. The Russian syndicates, particularly the one Mogilevich helped shape, operated more like a decentralized network or a consortium. They were a loose confederation of semi-autonomous brigades, each with its own specialty, all connected through a shared pool of money and resources. A communal fund, known as an obshchak. Mogilevich was the master of this fund. He wasn't a godfather in the traditional sense, demanding fealty through ritual and violence. His power was more modern. It was based on his indispensable financial acumen. He controlled the flow of money, and in doing so, he controlled everything. His schemes grew in scale and audacity. One of his most significant early operations involved Incombank, one of Russia's largest private banks at the time. Through his influence, the bank allegedly became a massive money laundering machine for the Russian mob and corrupt officials. Billions of dollars in illicit funds, from racketeering, embezzlement of state assets, and other criminal activities, were funneled through Incombank and then routed through a dizzying maze of shell companies, most notably a front in the Channel Islands called Benex. From there, the money would be wired to the Bank of New York, where it would be cleaned and finally enter the legitimate global financial system. The scale was breathtaking, estimated to be in the range of $10 billion. It was a financial superhighway for dirty money, and Mogilevich was its chief architect, demonstrating his genius for exploiting the seams of a globalized banking system that was not yet equipped to handle such a sophisticated assault. As the 1990s progressed, Mogilevich realized that to truly internationalize his empire, he needed a base of operations outside the turbulent and increasingly scrutinized environment of Moscow. He needed a foothold in Europe, not in a major Western capital like London or Paris, where law enforcement was strong, but somewhere in the newly liberated Eastern Bloc, a country with a fragile government, developing law enforcement, and a desperate need for foreign investment, a place where a man with a suitcase full of cash could buy influence and operate with relative impunity. He chose Hungary. In 1991, he moved to Budapest, a city still blinking in the bright, chaotic light of post-communism. He quickly established himself, not as a gangster, but as a legitimate businessman. For appearances, he entered into a marriage of convenience with a Hungarian national, Catalin Pop, which secured him a Hungarian passport and the freedom of movement it afforded. He began buying up businesses, creating a portfolio that was as strategic as it was diverse. He invested in nightclubs and restaurants, which served as perfect locations for mob meetings, and cash-intensive businesses ripe for money laundering. One of his establishments, the Black and White Club in Budapest, quickly became infamous as a central hub for gangsters, spies, and shadowy businessmen from across the former Soviet Union. But his most audacious and strategically brilliant acquisition was a struggling manufacturing plant called Magnex Army Co-op. On paper, it was a company that produced industrial magnets. In reality, it was a former state-owned weapons factory. With the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, factories like this all over Eastern Europe were left with massive stockpiles of Soviet-era weaponry and the machinery to produce more. By purchasing this company, Mogilevich effectively acquired his own private arms dealership. He now had direct, untraceable access to a vast arsenal of military hardware, from assault rifles and mortars to anti-tank rockets and, allegedly, even armored personnel carriers. This move transformed his criminal enterprise from a national syndicate into a global security threat. Law enforcement agencies from multiple countries began to track his activities, alleging that Mogilevich was using his Hungarian base to sell these weapons to the highest bidder, with no regard for ideology or consequence. His client list was said to be a who's who of global pariahs and conflict zones. There were allegations of deals with Iranian state actors, with paramilitary groups in the Balkans during the Yugoslav wars, and with various insurgent movements around the world. He was allegedly able to provide not just the weapons, but also the logistical support to deliver them anywhere on the planet. The most chilling rumors, which have been consistently reported by intelligence agencies, though never definitively proven in a court of law, involve the trafficking of nuclear materials. In the chaos following the Soviet collapse, the security around the vast Soviet nuclear arsenal and its related materials was notoriously lax. Informants and intelligence reports have repeatedly suggested that Mogilevich and his network were involved in trying to acquire and sell enriched uranium on the black market. One such case involved a 1998 report from a Hungarian newspaper, citing intelligence sources, that claimed authorities had thwarted a deal in which Mogilevich's associates were attempting to sell nuclear material to agents of Al-Qaeda. While these claims remain in the realm of intelligence chatter rather than hard evidence, they are the primary reason why law enforcement officials began to use phrases like "most dangerous in the world," "a mobster who can steal your money is a threat," "a mobster who can allegedly sell a suitcase bomb to a terrorist group is a threat to global civilization." Through all this, Mogilevich maintained his public persona. He was Don Semion, a respected if feared figure in Budapest's business community. He was known for his sharp suits, his expensive tastes, and his entourage of bodyguards. He projected an aura of untouchable power. He had reportedly cultivated connections at the highest levels of Hungarian government and law enforcement, ensuring that any local investigations into his activities would be quietly shut down. For a time, Budapest was his personal fiefdom, the perfect European headquarters from which to manage a sprawling, transnational criminal empire. But his greatest scam, the one that would finally make his name infamous in the United States, was already taking shape, not in a smoky backroom, but on the seemingly respectable floor of a North American stock exchange. While building his European empire of arms and influence, Semion Mogilevich was also orchestrating his most intricate financial fraud, a masterwork of deception aimed squarely at the heart of Western capitalism. The vehicle for this crime was a company that, on the surface, seemed utterly mundane: IBM Magnex International. IBM was headquartered not in Moscow or Budapest, but in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia, in Newtown, Pennsylvania. It was officially in the business of manufacturing high-strength industrial magnets, a product used in everything from computers to medical equipment. The company's story was a compelling one, a fusion of post-Soviet technological know-how with American marketing and capital. The entire operation, however, was an elaborate fiction from its inception. IBM Magnex was little more than a phantom, a complex architecture of shell companies, forged documents, and phantom transactions designed for a single purpose: to defraud investors on a massive scale. The anatomy of the scam was breathtaking in its complexity. It began with the Hungarian magnet factory, Army Co-op, which Mogilevich already controlled. He created a labyrinthine ownership structure, running the company through a series of shell corporations registered in the Channel Islands, a notorious tax haven. This obscured his own involvement and made the company's finances nearly impossible to audit. The Pennsylvania headquarters was essentially a storefront, a fake facade of legitimacy designed to appeal to North American investors. The core of the fraud was a scheme to artificially inflate the value of the company through fabricated sales. Mogilevich's network would create fake invoices, documenting millions of dollars in magnet sales between YBM and other shell companies that he secretly controlled. It was a closed loop. Money would be wired from one Mogilevich-controlled entity to another, creating the illusion of a thriving, profitable business. In reality, very few actual magnets were ever sold. The company's soaring revenues, which were dutifully reported to investors and regulators, were almost entirely imaginary. To complete the deception, they allegedly bribed their own auditors to sign off on the fraudulent financial statements, giving the company a clean bill of health. With its impressive and entirely false financials, YBM Magnex went public on the Toronto Stock Exchange in 1994. This was the endgame. The company, now perceived as a high-tech success story, became a darling of the market. Investment brokers promoted the stock, and ordinary people, pension funds and institutional investors, poured money into it, eager to get a piece of the action. This is what is known as a pump and dump scheme. Mogilevich and his associates used the manufactured hype to pump up the stock price to astronomical levels. At its peak, YBM Magnex had a market capitalization of over 1 billion Canadian dollars. Then, once the stock price had been inflated to its maximum potential, the dump began. Mogilevich and his co-conspirators, who held vast amounts of the stock through their anonymous offshore entities, began to sell off their shares, converting the artificially inflated paper value into hundreds of millions of dollars of cold, hard cash. As they flooded the market with their shares, the price inevitably began to collapse. The truth about the company started to leak out. Journalists and financial analysts began asking questions. Why were all of YBM's supposed customers also obscure offshore companies? Why was it impossible to verify any of their sales? In May of 1998, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, who had been quietly investigating the company for years, finally raided YBM's headquarters in Pennsylvania. The house of cards came crashing down. The stock became worthless overnight. The company declared bankruptcy, and the investors, the pension funds, the retirees, the everyday people who believed they were investing in a legitimate business, lost everything. The total value of the fraud was estimated to be at least $150 million. It was one of the largest stock scams of its kind in history. In 2003, a federal grand jury in Philadelphia handed down a 45-count indictment against Semion Mogilevich and his top lieutenants, charging them with racketeering, securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. It was a comprehensive and damning case, the result of years of painstaking investigation by the FBI and the IRS. The indictment laid bare the entire anatomy of the scam, a textbook example of how to weaponize the global financial system. But there was one major problem. The chief architect of the entire scheme, Semion Mogilevich, was not in Pennsylvania. He wasn't even in Hungary anymore. He was back in Moscow, living openly and, more importantly, living under the protection of a Russian constitution that forbids the extradition of its own citizens. The indictment was a powerful statement, but with its primary target safely ensconced in Russia, it was, for all practical purposes, unenforceable. After the collapse of YBM Magnex, and with international arrest warrants piling up against him, Semion Mogilevich retreated to the one place he knew he would be safe: Russia. By the early 2000s, he was living a life of quiet luxury in or around Moscow. He was no longer the public-facing Don Semion of Budapest. He retreated into the shadows, granting occasional interviews to journalists where he would calmly deny all allegations against him, painting himself as a victim of anti-Semitic persecution or as a simple businessman whose ventures had been misunderstood. He claimed he was nothing more than a consultant for IBM, that his only income was from selling Russian wheat. This period cemented his status as an untouchable. Despite being one of the most wanted men by multiple Western law enforcement agencies, he lived without fear of arrest. This immunity was not an accident. It was a function of his immense value and deep connections within the Russian power structure. In the world of the Russian mafia, the ultimate form of protection is known as a krycha, which translates to roof. A krycha is a powerful patron, typically within the state security services or the government, who provides protection from law enforcement and rival gangs in exchange for a share of the profits or other services. Mogilevich, with his financial genius and his global network, was believed to have the most powerful krycha of all, elements within the Russian state itself. His syndicate provided services that were incredibly useful to a state operating in the gray zones of international politics. He could move money discreetly, procure sensitive materials, and allegedly act as a financial intermediary in deals the Kremlin couldn't officially touch. He was, in a sense, a privatized intelligence asset, a criminal instrument of the state. This symbiotic relationship between organized crime and the state is a core feature of his syndicate's anatomy. He wasn't just a criminal fighting the system. He was a criminal who had, in many ways, merged with it. A bizarre episode in 2008 perfectly illustrated his complex and protected status. Mogilevich was arrested in Moscow in a dramatic, televised raid. The charges were not for the billion-dollar stock fraud or international arms trafficking. They were for tax evasion related to a cosmetics firm called Arbot Prestige. For a moment, it seemed the ghost had finally been caught. He was held in Butyrka prison for over a year. Western governments watched with bated breath. But then, just as quietly as he was arrested, he was released in 2009. The charges were dropped. The official reason given was that he was released on medical grounds. Most observers, however, interpreted the event not as a genuine attempt at justice, but as a message. It was either a dispute over money between powerful factions or a signal from the Kremlin reminding Mogilevich and everyone else who was ultimately in charge. Once the message was delivered, he was free to go. In that same year, 2009, the FBI, frustrated by their inability to bring him to justice for the IBM fraud, placed Semion Mogilevich on its prestigious 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. He was only the 7th organized crime figure to ever receive the distinction. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to his arrest. His face, round and bespectacled, was suddenly everywhere. But the gesture was largely symbolic. The FBI knew perfectly well where he was. The problem wasn't finding him, it was getting him. Then, in 2015, another surprising development. The FBI quietly removed Mogilevich from the 10 Most Wanted list. He had not been captured. He had not been cleared. The official explanation was that the list is reserved for fugitives who are believed to be in a location where the FBI can effectively operate and pursue them. By removing him, the Bureau was making a tacit admission of defeat. They were acknowledging the geopolitical reality that as long as he remained in Russia, there was no realistic prospect of his capture. The case remained open, but the active pursuit was over. He had won. The ghost had successfully dematerialized, not by hiding in a cave, but by standing in plain sight, shielded by the sovereignty of a nation-state. Today, Semion Mogilevich is believed to be in his late 70s. He continues to live freely in Russia. While he maintains a low profile, intelligence agencies and crime experts believe he remains a highly influential figure in the global criminal underworld. He is a consultant, a financier, a boss of bosses who no longer needs to involve himself in the day-to-day mechanics of crime. His legacy is not in the bodies left behind or the territory conquered, but in the systems he built and the blueprint he created. He is the patriarch of a new form of organized crime. As we dissect the final anatomy of his enterprise, we see that it is a creature of the modern world. It is transnational, decentralized, and deeply enmeshed with the legitimate global economy. It is a network, not a pyramid, able to adapt and shift, with nodes in dozens of countries. Its primary weapons are not guns and knives, but laptops, burner phones, and brilliant accountants. It thrives on the complexity and anonymity of offshore banking, on the inconsistencies between international laws, and on the willingness of corrupt officials to look the other way. Mogilevich understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the greatest heists of the 21st century would not involve cracking a safe, but exploiting a legal loophole. The story of Semion Mogilevich is a chilling lesson in the nature of modern power. It reveals a world where the lines between statecraft and criminality can become terrifyingly blurred, where a man can be simultaneously designated a global threat by one government and an untouchable asset by another. He demonstrated that with enough money and the right connections, justice becomes a negotiable concept, subject to the whims of international relations. His enduring freedom is a testament to a system he both mastered and corrupted. In the end, the most frightening aspect of Semion Mogilevich isn't the alleged arms deals or the brazen fraud. It's the revelation that in the modern world, the most dangerous mobster doesn't need a fortress of stone and steel. He needs only a comfortable home in a country that will not give him up, proving that the most effective prison walls are not made of concrete, but of geopolitics. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.